Oh, hey, Persona 5 is on sale. Never actually had time to play that before. Wonder how long it is.
75 years later.
Well, I have some thoughts. So my cards may be very much on the table from the title of this video, but before we get into it too much, let's clear up two quick things. Firstly, on spoilers. I'm trying my best to avoid Atlas sending hired goons after me for posting video footage of the game, but my thoughts on the endgame are kinda crucial to my main points, so there's only so much I can dance around that. Essentially, if you're watching this to decide whether or not to play Persona 5 and are at all sensitive to such things, maybe don't continue. But do go play it, then come back here, because it's overall a brilliant experience, and more importantly, I need those sweet, sweet views on Royal?
Persona 5 Royal.
In 2020, Atlas released an updated version of the game with some quality of life changes, DLC bundled in, other additions like a new character and some tweaks to the plot. I won't be covering these because of the deeply scientific reason that I only played the original. The issues that the quality of life changes addressed didn't bother me all that much in my playthrough, other than Morgana telling me to go to sleep a little bit too often, and the larger additional content seems like it stretches the game out even longer, which is a point we'll get to soon enough, my friends, be sure of that. I'd originally intended to organise this video into a YouTube-friendly numbered list, but immediately after finishing the game realised that might be a bit reductive. So let's just get rolling. Jesus Christ, the opening 10 hours of Persona really kicked down the door, blasted smooth jazz at me, and stole my heart. Yeah, you get it? It stole my heart. It's a game about stealing hearts. I'm the only person to ever make this reference, and I am a good games critic! No video about Persona would be complete without a mention of the art style, and I'm not here to disappoint. The comic book aesthetic permeates every element of the game, from battle animations, dialogue boxes, even to segues between menu screens. It's just such a goddamn audio-visual treat, man, and is what primarily drew me in during what I've seen people described as a pretty slow opening. Admittedly, the style isn't going to be to everyone's taste. Like, what you see on screen here is largely what you'll see for most of the game, and even though I love it personally, I'd be being disingenuous to claim it was, subtle? Maybe some options to hide elements of this UI when they're not being used would have been useful. I'm of the opinion that user options rarely are a bad thing. The time and date loom over the UI for the entire game in much the same way they loom over almost every aspect of the game itself. If you're still watching this and haven't played Persona 5, it's based entirely around the schedule of a day, really. There's none of this classic open-world RPG shit of having it drilled into you that you're on a quest to save your child, but taking a 40-hour break to go hunt monsters or build a settlement is a good idea. Most activities progress the game world time, and there's only so long you can ignore the pressing main quest to take your cat to the movies or go fishing with your mates. Most of the time, you're going to school, doing some nice, normal school life activities like answering questions about the history of Japan while your secret desk cat cheers you on and you cheat by asking the internet for help. Side note on cultural differences, actually, a lot of the early plot revolves around your classmates being extremely distrustful of you because you've got a criminal record, which, coming from an English school, seemed a bit odd at first, like, shouldn't you be the most popular kid in school or something? The point is, maybe having an option to hide the date and time wouldn't have hurt the aesthetics that much. It's there to impress upon you how important the time is, but I'm not a bloody goldfish, as far as you know. This could have probably just reappeared when the time changes if you're doing something that doesn't actually progress the time along, such as the hours-long palace infiltrations. More on these soon. You don't have to cheat on your general knowledge questions in school, by the way, and indeed can't once the end of term tests come along, a realisation that inspired the same level of sudden panic in me that real exams in school did when I realised I'd been thinking about cats more than the subject then too. However, getting the answers right increases your knowledge stat, one of the social stats which mostly controls the rate at which you can play side quest content, and deciding what activities to do based around the stats it will increase will be a large part of the game for a lot of people. I kind of wish that the school questions weren't part of this mechanic, because you'll want to take every chance you can to increase those stats, which means if you don't happen to know what the kanji for snail looks like off the top of your head, you're just going to cheat, which takes away a bit the satisfaction of it for me. This is a super minor gripe, really. I just wanted Morgana to tell me I'm smart based off my own attempts, and not because I used phone a friend in fear of missing out on another knowledge point. Look, I just want Morgana to love me, okay? I'm sorry! You're introduced to the idea that side content is gated behind levels of these stats early on when you want to hang out with your teammate Anne, but she's got the cheek to think you're not kind enough. While, again, this makes sense from an RPG perspective, it does lead to some slightly odd results where you're shoveling gigantic burgers into your face day after day to give yourself enough guts to talk to the owner of the gun shop about an item he gave you in the first place. Maybe I should just play a dating sim instead of, oh god, never mind. Anyway, after school, you usually have the choice to do almost anything you fancy, like hanging out with your best bud Ryuji, or the aforementioned shoveling gigantic burgers into your face. The days, much like our short, fleeting lives, tend to be split into 3 sections: school, after school, and evening. The life sim element rears its head here, as obviously certain things aren't open at certain times, and your schoolmates aren't necessarily going to hang around the streets late into the night waiting for you to hang out with them, the selfish pricks. The gameplay loop of deciding what to do with your time and trying to plan ahead for what stats you need to increase is honestly really moorish and engaging. It's all dripping with personality and genuinely well written, endearing dialogue. There's just such a great sense of humour that permeates the side of the game, and it's one of the biggest aspects of why I found Persona so addictive. Most of the characters have interesting, believable arcs and strike a nice balance between extreme JRPG sincerity and self-aware humour. I played through Dragonquest XI almost entirely off the back of Tim Rogers' famous review, and in that he describes it as a great hangout game. You're hanging out with your buds, which may be true, but I have now seen the light as to what a true bud hanging out game can be, and Dragon Quest ain't it, Tim. Few lines of dialogue round a campfire? How about a day reading books together and then making your mate a delicious coffee on a rainy day? Now that's good hanging out. And all your pissing about going fishing or going to the cinema has benefits that extend to the battles. Each social link you increase has quantifiable positives for the fighting, as your team gain new abilities as you rank them up through the 10 levels of friendship. Honestly though, I wasn't even finding myself trying to min-max these for that reason. The characters are so lovingly written and the activities have that Studio Ghibli food prep quality of just being a delight to experience. I've never wanted a curry and a coffee more in my goddamn life than while playing Persona. Weird that I'd latch onto aspects of a game based around socialising and routine right now. I wonder if there's anything happening in the real world that might have influenced that. As in the real world though, you can't spend all your time pissing around with friends, and eventually you'll have to get back to the cold, hard graft of the other half of the game. The palaces. These are the dungeons, in where you'll be doing a large part of your turn-based fighting, and hearing this over and over and over and over. The aim is to progress through enemies and puzzles to steal the twisted heart of someone who's being a total dick in the real world. More often than not, a shady adult who's making the kids' lives misery. If you're expecting just some high school musical level dickery of adults here, just not understanding I don't want to do my homework, man, then you'll be, pleasantly surprised to find that Persona isn't afraid to go real dark, real quick with its antagonists straight off the bat. Physically and sexually abusive teachers and suicide attempts are pretty bold opening gambit for a fun, jazz soundtracked high school RPG. The game is split into these anime season-esque arcs of dealing with a particular case at a time, and it does a generally great job of riling you up to be rooting for these jerks to get their comeuppance. You'll encounter someone in the real world who needs a damn good beating, then transition into the metaverse to find their treasure, a symbol of their twisted desires and how they've turned into such gits in the real world. Once you've stolen it, they'll hopefully realise how very not cool they've been and confess their sins. You can then sell the trinket for some fat dollar to go spend on a slap-up meal with your buds. Older Persona's palaces were randomly generated, a fact I relay with the full confidence of a man who hasn't actually played any of them, whereas these are tightly designed puzzle boxes that gradually unlock as you poke at their edges, defeat enemies, and have solutions to traps spelled out for you. The opening sections were generally my favourite of these dungeons, each presenting a new set of enemies for whom you need to prod with elemental attacks to figure out the weaknesses and strategies. In battle, if you hit the enemy with an attack they're weak to, you'll get a crit and they'll be knocked down. Get them all down, and your team gets their guns out and moves in for a hold-up. Here you're given the option to either all-out attack, an animation that is deeply satisfying the first 100 times you see it, but might begin to tear at your psyche by hour 90, or have a chat with them. Extort them for money or rare items, or try and convince them to join your gang through at times a little unpredictable conversations. I love and hate this side of the game. It's how you acquire new personas for your main character, a Pokemon-esque aspect that encourages you to build a balanced squad with a wide array of strengths and weaknesses.
The enemy is we're the better. The enemy is weak. Ice attacks are out. The enemy is we're the better. The enemy is weak. Ice attack. The enemy. Ice. The enemy. We're the enemy. Ice. The we're the ice. The
because the same knockdown mechanics you can use against the enemy apply to you too, giving them an extra chance to combo attacks together and quickly rattle down your health. Battles in Persona 5 are, for the most part, speedy affairs, both sides rattling off crit attacks and knockdowns to chain as many moves together as possible. The downside of this Undertale-style chatting system is that my classic whinge of inventory management rears its head again, as you only have a limited number of slots to hold Persona, and any new ones you get, while you have a full set, require you to decide who you want to release. It's a feature designed for balance, like so many others, I'm sure, and at the start of each palace you can freely go combine personas into stronger ones to make room for new capture. But I'd find myself clearing up some space at the start of a palace, and within 5 minutes having 4 slots again, necessitating either another trip back to decide who gets the literal in a brilliant feature that French Revolutions your unwanted guy, or, more often than not as the game progressed, just choosing not to bother getting new ones. In an ideal world, I'd have loved some Pokemon PC style ability of sending creatures you don't have space for back to storage, because the designs of many of the personas are great, each with their own little backstory that influences their theme and visuals, with loads of nods to real world myths and legends. They're really well designed and encourage collection, it's just, a bit of a faff. Initially as well, I was hoping there might be a way to fully passive run it, again in Undertale style, but eventually you're going to have to start murdering things, and that's fine, that's just not what type of game it is. Time only progresses when you leave the palace and return to the real world, and as you make your way through you'll find safe rooms which double as save points and fast travel points. The idea is you won't be able to storm through these dungeons in one visit, because the resource you use to cast spells with your personas, SP, is far harder to replenish than its equivalent in something like Final Fantasy. The in-universe explanation, and that's basically your character's energy level, and when you have a nice sit down and a catch up in one of the safe rooms, Morgana will remind you, the strangely silent leader, that hey, people are kind of bleeding from the face and can barely walk, maybe you should go rest up and come back another day. This leads to a satisfying progression where you're gradually chipping away at the palace, deciding in the real world how many days you can safely burn learning how to make coffee from your lovably grumpy guardian before diving back in to fight. You generally get most of the month to tackle each palace, but this still, at least in the early game before you've sussed out the tricks, permeates the experience with a mild panic that you're going to run out of time. This time management is a real concern, and why you'll often see Persona fans extolling the virtues of keeping multiple saves in case you dig yourself a hole too deep to get out of without resetting a few hours of progress. The slight hiccup with all this, at least on normal difficulty, is that palaces fairly quickly become easily achievable in a single visit, so long as you're putting even a modicum of effort into managing your SP, and have the sense to take a few SP consumables with you. These consumables are rationed in a pretty clever way, to be fair. Rarely can you buy any that increase your SP more than a couple of points at a time, the larger gains being exclusive to items like coffee or curry that take up time in your day to actually create by hand. You can also acquire accessories which replenish a bit of SP each turn from the emo doctor, as long as you're making sure to swing by to entertain her regularly, which if you're anything like me, you'll pour resources into when you realise how crucial SP is. Eventually though, you'll be blasting through 90% of these dungeons the first or second time you visit them, willfully ignoring your teammates' pleas for rests, the cowards! Throughout the course of the game, it'll throw roadblocks that require leaving the palace to go fix something in the real world before you can progress, and I feel like maybe this could have been expanded on a little more. It's not really a problem I have with the game as such, as it was a choice I made to get through them as quickly as possible, so that I could get back to the social simulator aspect, but it does create a somewhat askew pacing feel when the chunks of time you're spending battling and puzzling are separated by literal hours of social activities. That pacing still largely felt fun though for me, and aside from the odd few instances where things slowed down to a crawl, I happily blasted through the first 90 hours of the game, a phrase that can't be said about many games. Then, near the end of one of the late game palaces, the plot started really picking up steam. The flashback framing device that the plot is based around started to merge with events, warnings to save instructed me that things were about to progress quickly, plot points that had spanned the whole game started to wind up. Here we go, I thought to myself, we're in the final stretch now. Hey, maybe if I pull a late one I can even finish it tonight and start writing that video I've been delaying for weeks now.
So that was a fucking lie.
Then the game kept going, it just kept going. Now, whether or not a game is too long or not is kind of a subjective opinion. You might be happy to play 300 hours of The Witcher if it keeps you engaged for that long. Multiplayer games too are the classic example of games people can play for hundreds of hours, but the pacing of this latter stage of Persona is just so off. Time and again the characters and plot ramp up to what feels like the big payoff, and then it just stalls and continues. For one thing, the final palace is such a down note for me personally. It endeared itself to me at first, the time-honoured tradition of throwing adorable shit at me like, look at these guys! Look at their little masks! Morgana's a cat and a mouse! But as it went on, it just turned into a slog. A lot of the palaces balance out fighting, puzzles and plot pretty damn well I thought, but this was such a long, convoluted set of puzzles I was really starting to lose the drive that had propelled me through so many hours so far. It doesn't help things that the central conceit of this palace is to find 5 separate people to give you letters that will let you into the main treasure room. You find each person, have a bit of banter, and what looks like might be a cool little speech puzzle is actually just a force minibus. My feelings about this palace can be applied to just this entire last section of the game. It could be trimmed down, not necessarily removed, so that's awful, but it really starts to feel like you're nearing the end of a long-running TV show that's just throwing in filler episodes to pad the timing out before the big finale. We should be approaching the end of such a story-driven game at breakneck speed, excited to see the climax of the trial we've been through. Instead, Persona splutters about for a while, pulls a few switcheroos, and kicks you back to the real world to potter about for a bit longer. This is the only time in the game where the social element started to grate on me, as it's another few hours of the pace grinding to a literal halt. We've learned everything we're going to learn about these characters. We're not experiencing anything we haven't done hundreds of times over in the battles, we're just repeating ourselves at this point. Don't worry though, this pace-killing juddering to a halt happens at least a few more times in the last few hours. After another long walk in a puzzle section, I'm finally at the last boss, I said to myself, before the game dragged me out of it for another cutscene, which is fine, I'm here for the story, I really am. Then, instead of keeping that momentum by throwing you against a final battle, there's another mini-boss rush in a set of corridors. This isn't how to pace a good story, guys. The actual hours length of the game is kind of irrelevant at this point. If this was a 30-hour game and I was led to believe it was coming to a close, only to be kicked out to a 10-hour dungeon that adds nothing, I'd still find it frustrating. Trim the fat, keep the momentum going, and end on a high, not frustration. It's a shame really, because I thoroughly enjoyed the final fight, and once I'd had a cup of tea to calm down and stopped kicking off to my loved ones about this. And another thing, why does Futaba always talk over Morgana? It's so unfair, like he's the leader. I remembered how much I'd loved the vast amount of time I'd spent in this world. I watched the classic driving into the horizon final cutscene and let the credits roll, finally content I was saying goodbye to what became one of my absolute favourite games. And then, turning into a parody of its own repetition, there's another driving into the horizon cutscene after the credits. Who is editing? Anyway, that's the story of how I didn't play New Game Plus. Thanks for watching, I love it really!
What's up? Good morning. How are you feeling? I'm hot. I'm cold. It's so wet out. Do you think it's gonna rain? It's way too cold. So humid.